Good evening. My name is Stella Chitralekha Biswas, and I am a faculty in the Department of English, Sarojini Naidu College for Women, Kolkata. I welcome you to the stories of tribal identity and culture that will explore the role of tribal history and tribal representation in history in shaping cultural identity and ideology, curated under TMYS Review, Summer 2023, in collaboration with the Center for Asia Pacific Initiatives, University of Victoria. We are also calling for the submission of essays, poems, and short stories under the project. To know more about the submission guidelines and the project architecture, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. This evening, I consider myself very privileged to be in the company of our esteemed panelists, Dr. Abin Chakraborty, Dr. Surama Bera, and Ms. Nandini Sengupta, who will shortly share their views and insights with us. The topic for today's discussion is gender roles in tribal traditions and heritage under the sub-theme Gender and Folklore, a Historical Perspective. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker for the session is Dr. Abin Chakraborty. Dr. Abin Chakraborty is an assistant professor in English in Chandanagar College. He is the editor of the international online journal Post-Colonial Interventions and also the author of the monograph Popular Culture, published by Orient Black Swan in 2019. His articles have been published in several national and international journals and anthologies. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Chakraborty. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Stella. It's
Our,
my
se-
pleasure.
our second speaker for the session is Dr. Surama Bera. Dr. Surama Bera teaches at the Department of Communicative English, Ashutosh College. She has completed her PhD in English from Shidho Kanho Birsha University, Purulia. Her PhD thesis focused on the oral narratives of the marginalized, underprivileged people of Purulia. She has presented papers in several national and international conferences. Her area of research interest includes performance narratives, folklore studies, cultural studies, and gender studies. It is a pleasure to have you with us today, Dr. Bera. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Stella. It's a pleasure.
Our third speaker for the session is Ms. Nandini Sengupta. Ms. Nandini Sengupta is a Pondicherry-based journalist and author of historical fiction and narrative history. After a chance visit to the Ajanta-Ellora caves, she became fascinated with India's past in general and ancient and early medieval India in particular. For the next 10 years, she read history for fun, and when she began to write, it was history she turned to for material. Her book credits include the best-selling The Blue Horse and Other Amazing Animals from Indian History, published by Hachette, which debuted in November 2020, The King Within, The Poisoned Heart, and The Ocean's Own, books 1, 2, and 3 of the Gupta Empire trilogy, published by HarperCollins India in 2017, 2019, and 2021 respectively, and The Story of Kalidas, The Gem Among Poets by Aiker Goodearth Publications, published in 2019. Rani Durgavati, The Forgotten Life of a Warrior Queen, published by Penguin India, is her first narrative non-fiction biography. We are delighted to have you on the panel, Ms. Sengupta. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you. It's an honor.
We will now open the forum for discussion. I would request Dr. Chakraborty to share his insights. Sir, over to you now.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be a part of this discussion. Folk culture is often the domain of those subaltern classes who are generally deprived of the means of documentation and representation. A.K. Ramanujan, a famous folktale and folklore scholar, said, folk materials also comment continually on official and orthodox views and practices in India. Here, if we listen, we can hear the voice of what is fashionably called the subaltern, the woman, the peasant, the non literate, those who are marginal to the courts of kings and offices of the bureaucrats, the centers of power. The folktales of the Adivasis of India, who have been experiencing persecution for centuries, not only embody such subaltern counter discourses, but they also contribute to the oral transmission and preservation of cultural resources for communities whose inherited language and culture are often threatened by the texts and discourses of the dominant orders. However, subalternity is generally characterized by both defiance and submission. Adivasi folklores are also therefore shaped by a continuous dialectic of appropriation and abrogation in relation to the constitutive currents of dominant discourses. This is as true for the representation of gender norms in Adivasi folktales as it is for the representation of other issues related to nature, wealth, family relationships, and much else. Therefore, while on the one hand we witness in Adivasi folktales a generally egalitarian attitude and a sustainable planetary consciousness which contrast either the hierarchical or the anthropocentric attitude found in many myths and legends associated with syndicated religions of one kind or another. On the other hand, there are many folk tales which mimic the binaries and hierarchies innate to non Adivasi communities and discourses. The rest of my talk will focus on evidences of such ambivalence and analyze them both in terms of counter hegemonic thrusts and contemporary relevance. One may begin, for example, by focusing on the origin myth of the Shautals, where we are told about how Thakurjiu created out of clay a pair of male and female ducks, which then gave birth to two eggs, from which were born the first man and woman. Such a narrative not only emphasizes the intimate kinship between humanity and nature, but also a worldview bereft of originary gendered divisions. Unlike Christianity, which shows the first woman Eve as being born out of Adam's ribs, or Hinduism, which foregrounds the role of Brahma as the supreme male progenitor who is able to give birth to different castes from his own limbs without the presence of any corresponding female being. Santal myths showcase the instrumental role played by both Malinbudhi and Jahir Era in first creating a pair of goose and gander called Has and Hasil, and then protecting their eggs from which are hatched Pilku Haram and Pilku Budhi, the first Santal beings. Such a narrative not only challenges the dominant anthropocentric discourse, which has played a major role in bringing about the kind of ecological crisis that the world is currently experiencing, but also foregrounds a fundamental equality between both genders in generating and sustaining life. One might even argue that the Santal origin myths thus operate as a kind of hidden polemic against origin myths associated with Abrahamic or Vedic traditions. As Mikhail Bakhtin explains in a hidden polemic, and I quote, the author's discourse is directed towards its own referential object, but at the same time, every statement about the object is constructed in such a way that apart from its referential meaning, a polemical blow is struck at the other's discourse at the same time, at the other's statement about the same object. Now, the basic egalitarian premise of Chantal origin myth can therefore be read as a hidden polemic in relation to the aforementioned Abrahamic or Vedic narratives. However, it would be incorrect to presume that such radical counter-discursive thrusts are offered by all Adivasi folktales in general. In fact, many of them are also colored by the same processes of male chauvinism and patriarchal vilification which one witnesses in such legendary narratives as those associated with Sita's trial by fire, the petrification of Ahulya, the virtual prostitution of Madhavi by Galav for securing material gains, and so on and so forth. For example, in the Tale of the Magic Lamp, documented by Reverend Andrew Campbell, ordinary women are represented as being both idiotic and harmful through their repeated actions, which inflict deprivation and suffering among the men in their lives. For example, even though the fortune of the protagonist is gifted by the fairy of the magic lamp, the wife of the protagonist manages to sell the same lamp to a treacherous merchant, plunging both herself and her husband in danger. Incidentally, the marriage between the anonymous protagonist and his wife only becomes possible because the woman's father consents to the marriage proposal after receiving a majestic palace as a gift. Neither is her preference sought, nor is her consent relevant. Such narratives highlight how even in Adivasi folktales, women continued to operate as commodified pawns in material exchanges conducted between men. This element of feminine stupidity is also foregrounded in the tale of the two brothers, Jhoria and Jhore. When Jhore is caught by a demon and brought to its daughter, she is allured by Jhore's long hair and foolishly digs her own grave by allowing her head to be pounded in a thresher. In the same way, the tigress in the story asks Jhore's help to shave her cub's long hair, which leads to the death of the two cubs after boiling water is poured on both by Jhore. The association between stupidity and gender in such a narrative foregrounds a typical patriarchal bias, which is also in keeping with the binary of Akam and Puram tales mentioned by A.K. Ramanujan. This same bias, however, undergoes an ambivalent transformation in a folktale documented by Santosh Kumar Kiro, where a young wife is expelled from home by her father in law after he witnesses how she leaves home at night, transforms into an elephant, and becomes a human again upon her return. While such a narrative may seem to be indicative of patriarchal invective against apparent female bestiality and deceit, it is also to be noted that the husband in question joins the shape-shifting wife as part of an elephant couple. Afterwards, the elephant couple keeps roaming in forests and fields, including the paddy fields of the husband's father, and the narrative concludes by stating that all the elephants are descendants of this Munda couple and that they also clearly comprehend the Mundari language. Such a narrative, associated with the Kompat Munda and Keria clans of the Munda family of tribes, not only highlights the usual kinship between Adivasis and various aspects of flora and fauna, but there is also an implicit acknowledgement of woman's choice and agency, which is supplemented by the volitional support of the husband in question through a framework that metaphorically approves individual choices even when they are contradictory to inherited collective norms. Furthermore, the wife's act of going out at night and transforming into an elephant may also be read contrapuntally as an expression of the desire for freedom away from domestic confinement, symbolized by the patriarch's house, and the restrictive power of the threshold, represented by the howling of the dog, which might also stand for social censure. Adivasi folktales thus represent a diverse range of issues, representations, and concerns which cannot really be pigeonholed into exclusive categories of one kind or another. The critical objective should be to embark on a holistic analysis so that whatever is relevant and compatible with an egalitarian and ecologically sustainable future is widely disseminated, contemporaneously adapted, and zealously preserved. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your insightful observations, Dr. Chakraborty. I would now request Dr. Bera to share her thoughts. Ma'am, over to you now.
Thank you, Stella. Am I audible?
Yes, you are perfectly audible.
Uh, so the Indian Federation has 28 states and 8 union territories. And the area and the population of the union territories are generally small. So if we look at the 28 states, we would see that the indigenous communities and the tribal communities are spread over Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Goa, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, Himachal Pradesh, Gujarat, Jharkhand, Odisha, and obviously West Bengal. So, Purulia, which is located in the state of West Bengal, is such a region of India which is home to several indigenous and tribal communities. Today, I will focus primarily on the folk tales and the oral narratives of Purulia, which are practiced by the people residing in the region, because I was there in Purulia when I was pursuing PhD. So I thought that I would share my insights based on my observation. Purulia is a part of Chotanagpur Plateau, and it has a unique undulated landscape which is full of forests, hills, high and low agricultural plains. And this region is home to various ethnic groups such as Kumhar, Kurumi, Bhumij, Shautal, Ghashi, Orao, uh, Dom, Lohar, and many more. Not all of these ethnic communities are enlisted as tribes according to central government, but nonetheless, these communities are marginalized communities. So Purulia is home to several ethnic groups, and each ethnic community has its own cultural traditions as well as performative traditions. And people from heterogeneous communities come together and make Purulia culturally vibrant and divergent. Culture can be broadly bifurcated into two categories. One is lithic culture, and another one is alithic culture. The word lithic comes from the Greek word lithos, which means stone. So, whenever we inscribe something on stone or a paper or a wood, it becomes part of lithic culture. And this culture has vastly proliferated in Western countries. And the role of these lithic cultures is to record the memory in a concrete form outside the human body. So basically, when we record a song and when we preserve the song in a CD form, it becomes a part of lithic culture. And alithic culture are those cultural traditions which do not require any such surrogate body. So, the vast range of performative traditions of Purulia are basically part of this alithic culture because the body of the performer disseminates the memory. So, the repository system of this culture is the body of the performer. Now, song cultures of Purulia, such as Tushu, Jhumur, Bhadu, Udhoa, Jat, Bihar Geet, all these are lifeline to these people. And the people of Purulia, they often voice their rebel and resistance through these song cultures. So, these song cultures, if analyzed properly, give us some instances of rural people, especially rural women, who never got the chance to take recourse to literacy, like us, who do not even know the term patriarchy and who do not know how to subvert it, yet they silently challenge the patriarchal system within which they live. So these rural women, they subvert patriarchy by expressing their anguish and anger against society through their songs. Sometimes these women become vocal in expressing their sexual desires. Sometimes they vigorously protest against polygamy and social evils such as dowry system, child marriage, domestic violence. Sometimes they inspire other women to take recourse to literacy as it will bring them more power. So these song cultures give them the power to shape and preserve their identity as well. Tushu song, for instance, is one such song tradition through which the women of Purulia preserve their identity. And Tushu songs are an integral part of Tushu festival. So Tushu festival is celebrated throughout the month of Posh, Bengali month of Posh, and Tushu songs are based on various themes. Tushu songs are influenced by various contemporary political as well as social revolutions. Social issues such as dowry system, literacy, education of girl child, condition of a woman at her in-laws, how she is treated by her in-laws often become the subject of Tushu songs. Ogran Shankranti or Aghon Shankrait, this is a term which people of Purulia would prefer. Aghon Shankrait is considered to be a very auspicious day, and in the evening of Aghon Shankrait, Tushu idol is founded. In some areas, local people they do not use any idol. They keep some husk mixed with cow dung in an earthen pot, which is locally known as shora. And this shora is then decorated with vermilion and rice powder, and this is considered to be Tushu idol. So this idol is then decorated with garlands, and the women of Purulia continue to sing Tushu songs throughout the night, for the whole night on Ogran Shankranti. And they also sing these songs throughout the month of Posh while performing their daily chores or while rolling bidi and other work. So Tushu songs become a part and parcel of their life during this Bengali month of Posh. And these songs often become the voice of dissidents for the innumerable voiceless women of Purulia. I would just like to sing a few lines of a particular Tushu song to analyze how these song lyrics give the women the power to express their anguish and anger and their desire. So the song goes on like, Shuinele ma boli go tore, biha dibi aঠারোর pore go dibi aঠারোর pore, Shuinele ma boli go tore. বই খাতার সাইকেল দিছে, খাতে দিছে পেট ভরে, বই খাতার সাইকেল দিছে, খাতে দিছে পেট ভরে, 25,000 টাকা মাগো, 25,000 টাকা মাগো, দিছে বিহার বতরে, দিছে বিহার বতরে, শুইনেলে মা বলি গো তোরে. So yes, I know the pronunciation is probably not correct because I do not know the dialect properly. I haven't learned that yet. So the song lyrics actually, through this song, the girl expresses her voice, and this girl vehemently tells her mother that she will not get married until she turns 18, and she informs her mother about the different government schemes which will help the female children and give them the ability to dream about a better life. And towards the end of the song, she also informs her mother that if her parents want her to marry off before she turns 18, then they might get arrested. So the song addresses the burning issue of child marriage and expresses the voice of a young girl who vehemently states her decision and fights back against the patriarchal norms of the society. Another song protests against the practice of polygamy. So it goes on like, এগো এইটাই বটে বউ ছাড়াটা, ইহার ভাঙে দিব ঠ্যাং দুটা, কতজনের নষ্ট করে দিয়েছিস তুই জীবনটা, গুতায় গুতায় কেলাইব আজ, ভাঙে দিব ঠ্যাং পাঁজরাটা. And then it goes on like, একটা ছেড়ে একটা ধরিস, এটাই কি তোর স্বভাবটা, বাপের নামটা ভুলাইন দিব, তুলে লিব চামড়াটা. So basically, this song protests against the system of marriage as a business, where a man marries more than one girl to make money as dowry taken from the bride's parents. And through this song, the singer slams the people who practice polygamy and who treats marriage as a way to make money. So there are phrases like bhange dibo thang duta, that means break your legs. Tule libo chamrata will take your skin off. Bhulai dibo baper namta will beat you until you forget your father's name. So we see that though we think that the rural women are shy and docile and they silently accept the torture inflicted on them, This song is an obvious proof that such is not the case always, and they also know how to strike back and diminish patriarchy. So these folk songs, they tell the story of our life. They give an outlet to express joys, anguish, anger of the people who are residing in the region. So the rural women of Purulia find it easier to voice their protest through these songs, as most of them do not get the scope to take recourse to literacy. And in this situation, the song lyrics become the only medium through which they voice their subjugation. And in a way, they preserve their identity through these song cultures. Like Tushu, there are other performing traditions as well, like Nachni Nach, Jawa Geet, Korom Geet, and Postubala Devi, who is a Nachni performer. She has been recently awarded with Lalun Puroskar for her contribution to Nachni tradition. So I feel that there is a crying need to unveil and decode these cultural traditions, to inquire the role of women in the preservation of cultural traditions and heritage. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your thought-provoking observations, Dr. Bera. I would now request Ms. Sengupta to share her thoughts on the topic. Ma'am, over to you.
Thank you very much. I am going to talk a little bit about what I came across uh, from Gond folk tales and folk songs, which were one of the primary sources I have used to as research for my latest book, which is on Gond Rani Durgavati, published by Penguin India. When I was researching Rani Durgavati, it's very interesting looking at the Gond folk tales, which have been meticulously sort of documented and translated by Shamrao Hivale and Berrier Elwin. There are several volumes of folk tales and folk songs from Gondwana, which have been documented by them. Just a quick intervention here, just to explain which region I am talking about. Rani Durgavati and the Gond people are part of central India. The Gonds populate more or less the areas in and around Jabalpur and the surrounding districts of Damo, Dindori, Hoshangabad, Narsinghpur, and so on. So entire region right up to Nagpur actually was once called Gondwana, the land of the Gond. And Rani Durgavati's kingdom was one of the largest kingdoms in Gondwana, which was called Garha Mandla. So my talk will focus on the life of the tribal population of this region, and this region is primarily tribal, and the tribals are actually Gond tribals. So when we go back to what the Gond folk songs and folk tales um, talk about, it's very interesting because while there are lots of songs and stories about their origin myths and so on, which was just discussed a little bit earlier in this talk, there are several stories about their origin myths, but the vast majority of Gond folk songs and folk stories have a historical element in them. And this is something very, very interesting, which is why I found it easy to mine these songs and these tales as resource for my biography on Rani Durgavati. I'll just give you an example. Now, there is a folk tale called the History of Raja Pali Birwa. Now, in History of Raja Pali Birwa, this is a Pradhan folk tale where the king in question, that the king that is mentioned in this story, is Dalpat Shah. Now, Dalpat Shah is actually a historical figure. Dalpat Shah or Dalpati Shah was actually Rani Durgavati's husband. And similarly, several folk tales mention Rani Durgavati herself They talk about how she was a person who lost her husband very very early on in her life, and therefore she is called Dukhiari. This Dukhiari term comes again and again, and many folk tales actually reference her struggle as a woman who has lost her husband and has to then fend off attacks from people around her in order to come up trumps and then go on to become a queen who was so popular and so powerful that to this day she is revered and as a not just a model monarch but also as a goddess by both tribal Gonds and non-Gonds alike. So similarly, there's another story that I would like to reference. This one is the story of Raja Singhi Surwa. Now, in the story of Raja Singhi Surwa, again, what happens is if you follow the story, there is a grand wedding that happens. Raja Singhi Surwa marries. He is the son of Pemal Shah, who is the son of Dalpat Shah. So again, Dalpati is or Dalpat Shah is referenced. A historical character is referenced. Pemal Shah or Prem Shah was also a historical character. He was one of the descendants of Dalpat Shah who ruled Garha Mandla about 40, 50 odd years later. So his rule came much later. But these are historical figures who are mentioned. And in this story as well, we find that uh, the king is killed and Singhi Surwa is killed and his queen then goes on to there's a blood feud for the throne and the queen then goes on to defeat the usurper and becomes the regent for her son and rules the kingdom with remarkable efficiency. Now all these details that we find in Gond folk tales and folk songs repeatedly talk about a kind of golden age, and the golden age that they are referencing is the golden age of the Rajgond dynasty, of which Rani Durgavati is obviously the most well-known member. Although there were a couple of kings who were very, very powerful before her, but there is no monarch who is more revered and more respected than her. And in fact, Gond folk songs to this day, Gond bards to this day talk about Pure Rajma Sona Ka Sikka. So, and a kingdom that was covered with gold coins is certainly a very, very far-fetched claim. But that is the kind of aspiration that Rani Durgavati's reign promised for the Gonds back then and continue to do so to this day. A quick word here. When we talk about history, what do Gond folk tales and folk songs document post Rani Durgavati's reign? And this is where the picture gets very, very interesting. We find again and again songs of despair, songs of desperation, particularly by the time the region becomes part of first the company rule and later on colonial rule. So after the third battle, after the third Maratha war, when this region comes under the British, suddenly you find the tone and tenor of the songs change. And you have again and again references to famines. They talk about empty baskets, baskets empty of grain. They say, where will we find page? Let us go and sit in our homes where our children will not have page to eat. Now, what kind of food is page? Page is basically a millet gruel. This was the staple food of the Gonds at that time. And it is more or less, I mean, we can very safely say it is the scantiest food that you can have to keep life and limb alive. You know, it is about as little as a human being can survive on. And yet, this page is not available. And again, we find there is famine happening, there are epidemics happening, there is cholera happening, there are people dying, and the Gond folk songs talk about actually eating hair dung, you know, the dung of rabbits, and making a page or making a gruel with that. and drinking that, so the level of desperation, the level of um, destitution that you see in the songs that come around the time of the 19th, early 19th, right up to the mid 20th century is in stark contrast to the songs that came before that, which were talking about Pure Rajma Sone Ka Sikka. A quick word here about what the voice of women that you see in these songs. Again, it is very, very interesting because Gond songs are in many ways a little bit different from what my esteemed panelists were talking about, in the sense that in these songs, the voice being more political, there is less reference to the personal life, although the personal life comes in as they talk about girl and boy finding each other, and there are marriages being mentioned again and again. What kind of marriages, what kind of feasts that people have when there's a wedding in the village. So these are lighter songs, these are happier songs. When a pankha boy meets a pankha girl, when a when a pradhan boy meets a pradhan girl, and there is a love blossoming in the forest, those songs have, there is a personal angle to them. But other than those, the life that is documented by these songs is predominantly political and predominantly historical, and in this I think they are a significant departure from some of the other tribal literature that we may have in the region. One quick word here also about Rani Durgavati and the reverence that the tribal Gonds hold her to this day. Interestingly enough, Rani Durgavati herself was not tribal. She was a Chandela Rajput princess, and she married into the Rajgond dynasty. Remember, the Rajgond dynasty was a primarily tribal dynasty, because the only other example of an intercaste marriage in that dynasty is when the dynasty founder Yadurai married a tribal princess called Ratnabali and founded the dynasty. After that, Rani Durgavati's marriage to Dalpati Shah is the only other example of a non-Gond and a Gond marriage happening in the dynasty. And the interesting thing is, despite this, in every single folk tale, folklore and bard song to this day, I mean, Gond bards to this day, if you go to Jabalpur and the surrounding districts, there's a beautiful Samadhi sthal of Rani Durgavati at the place where she sacrificed her life for her honor and for her people. And there, every year on 24th of June, which is her Balidan Divas, there are, what they call diya bati. So there is a lamp that is lit and songs that are sung, and these are bard songs which are contemporary. People like DJ Sarman and others who are Gond bards, they sing about Rani Durgavati to this day. The other Balidan Divas that the Gonds celebrate is on 17th of September. And here I would like to reference a little bit how the contribution of the Gonds in our freedom struggle has been pretty much forgotten. Just like Rani Durgavati herself has become a small, forgotten, insignificant footnote in our attempt to lionize her opponent, which is Akbar, we have turned Rani Durgavati and her valor into a footnote. Similarly, the Gonds have become a footnote. Actually, not even a footnote, they've been erased. But the fact is that the Gonds had a very, very strong contribution to make in the 1857 uprising. And Rani Durgavati's descendants, Raja Shankar Shah and Raja Raghunath Shah, were one of the leaders of the rebellion. And they were caught by the British, tied to the muzzle of a cannon and blown away. And it is also wrong to think that the 1857 rebellion happened out of nowhere. The truth is that ever since the British took over control of that region, the first rebellion was the Bundela uprising, which happened in 1846, which was the precursor to the 1857 uprising. And of course, there were several uprisings all through till the final 1910 Maria Bastar uprising, when the Marias of Bastar rose in rebellion, and they were brutally, each of these uprisings were brutally put down. There were mass floggings, there was public execution, there were, the kings or the zamindars of the region were caught, they were tied to the muzzle of a gun and blown away, and it was brutally put down. And yet our history books today do not mention the contribution of these very brave and valorous Goans to our freedom struggle. So, in a sense, I would like to wrap up here saying that Goan folk songs and folk tales are a very important document of history, and in many ways a primary source that mirrors the life and the past heritage of these people in the heart of India.
Thank you very much for your invaluable perspectives, Ms. Sengupta. We will now move on to the question and answer session. My first question is for Dr. Chakraborty. In your article titled Examining Subalternity in Hashta Shobhendra Shekhar's The Adivasi Will Not Dance, you discuss the general absence of Adivasis from the domain of Indian English literature and the vexed question of representing subalterns. Do you feel that the question of Adivasi women as a doubly victimized subaltern category has been adequately challenged within newly emerging narratives of resistance?
There is a lot to be done in that particular realm. As far as Adivasi voice in Indian writing in English is concerned, Hashta Shobhendra Shekhar is very much a kind of a lone ranger. And of course, we do need the emergence of other voices, particularly female Adivasi writers who would be able to shed light on the experience of female Adivasis. Because so far as subalternization is concerned, Adivasi women continue to be doubly and even triply subalternized, especially because of the kind of sexual atrocities to which they are often subjected, either by the security forces or during, anti-Maoist campaigns, or by different kinds of paramilitary organizations, or by organizations like the Salwa Judum in Chhattisgarh, which have of course now been banned. But through all of these different agencies, we see that Adivasi women continue to suffer different kinds of exploitation in different ways. Also, if one looks at the issue of witch burning, or identifying women as witches and then subjecting them to different kinds of brutal punishments. That is also another axis along which Adivasi women continue to be exploited. And of course, these are issues which require much greater representation, documentation, and awareness than what exists now.
Thank you very much for answering that, Dr. Chakraborty. My next question is for Dr. Bera. Do you think that despite the crucial role tribal women play in the preservation of intangible cultural heritage and often the forgotten, their importance is somewhat undermined by the dominance of men and the privileges enjoyed by them in the public sphere?
I would say yes. Uh, we have seen that women play a crucial role in the preservation of intangible cultural heritages. In case of Purulia, we have seen that the rural women they play important roles to preserve several cultural traditions such as Tushu, Bhadu, Jat, Udhova, Jawa, Korom. But also in Maharashtra, we can see that the women sing grind mill songs that showcase women's abilities to represent themselves, articulate their suffering, subordination, suppression at the hands of patriarchy, and perpetuate their assertiveness. But often, their importance is somewhat undermined by the dominance of men, I feel. But I also feel that the scenario is changing nowadays. Gradually, the scenario is changing, and the male performers are also standing shoulder to shoulder with the female performers of several tribal communities. So in case of Purulia, I would say that Postubala Devi is a very famous artist now. And earlier, the Nachnis were actually not given their due respect. Only their Rasiks were known to everyone. But nowadays, the scene has changed a lot. So I feel that the scenario is changing gradually nowadays.
Thank you very much for answering that, Dr. Bera. My next question is for Ms. Sengupta. In your book, Rani Durgavati, you document the unheard tale of the fascinatingly brave tribal queen of the Gonds in Madhya Pradesh, Rani Virangana Durgavati. Do you, however, feel that revisiting and writing about Rani Durgavati's story, which has survived primarily in folk tales, songs, and oral lores, is in a way a challenge to the deliberate and selective biases in history?
Yes, I would absolutely agree with you. If you look at the way, and it is interesting to look at how Rani Durgavati's story has been handled uh, in contemporary times, which is in the last 60, 70 odd years, and how it was reported by chroniclers who were in fact her contemporaries. Now, if we look at Mughal chroniclers, people like Abul Fazl or Badauni or Ferishta, or we look at Sanskrit secular literature, or we look at temple inscriptions, there, the Rani's story has been recorded in great detail, and she elicits a lot of respect, sometimes very grudging respect, but a lot of respect from people who very often were actually her opponents, were her political rivals. But it is only in modern India that we suddenly find, since the 1960s onwards, till the 1960s, there was a lot of research being done on Rani Durgavati. There were several, Vrindavan Lal Sharma's beautiful book. It is a historical fiction book, but it's a really really well researched book on Rani Durgavati, and there were several other titles as well. People like Ram Bharos Agarwal, who was a Mandla historian. People like Rai Bahadur Hiralal and R.V. Russell, who were writing in the earlier part of the 20th century, and so on. These people, they were doing very very important seminal research. I have to mention a lot of the colonial Indologists, people like William Schliemann, for instance. Schliemann has written extensively about Rani Durgavati. People like Alexander Cunningham, for instance, has written a lot about Rani Durgavati. So the it's not as if she died and then she was forgotten immediately. She was forgotten in the last 60, 70 odd years, not before that. Her contemporaries and immediately afterwards, up until 200, 300 years since her death, people were talking about her. In fact, if you look at what the Indologists, how they have recorded her history, they call her the Indian Boudica. They call her, they put her in the same league as Sita. They say, she's a flower of blameless beauty. So, the kind of the terms that are used for her is in marvelously reverential. But from the 1960s onwards, she disappears. She has been airbrushed out of the mainstream narrative. How people remember her. To this day, if you go to Jabalpur, every nook and cranny bears her name with pride. Every single temple, every single tank has a connection with her. You ask anybody on the streets, you catch a person on the street and you say, आपने रानी दुर्गावती के बारे में सुना है? और वो कहेगा, जी वो तो हमारे रानी माँ थे, वो तो हमारे माता थे. So that the living memory is very much alive in her land, in Gondwana, in Garahamandla. But the rest of India forgot her. And I think the rest of India forgot her for a reason. What are the reasons? Number one, she was a woman. And while resistance to Mughal hegemony by others have been remembered, have been documented, have become part of the mainstream, in the case of the women, it has been completely and absolutely erased out of the mainstream discourse. Number two, she was the queen of a tribal kingdom. So, therefore, not important enough to come under the spotlight that we tend to focus on North India, on Delhi in particular. If our entire historical focus and spotlight is on Delhi, then an outlier kingdom like Garamandla would not be important, even though it was one of the richest kingdoms in medieval India. Number three, and this is no less important, her adversary was no less than the great Mughal Akbar. And this noble monarch has captured modern India's imagination so much that we tend to, and the long shadow that he casts on history is such a long shadow that we tend to forget those that come under that shadow. And this is not just true of Rani Durgavati. Akbar was actually tormented by two women in his lifetime, and we have managed to forget both. The first was Rani Durgavati, the second was Chand Bibi. So, so somehow, because we are making the greats out of an adversary who was Rani Durgavati's main enemy and the reason for her death and the destruction of a dynasty, she has become a footnote in history, which to her people she was not. And to this day, if you go and check out the Gond folk tales and folk songs, without exception, they despise Akbar. In that part of India, Akbar is not a hero. It is Rani Durgavati who's the hero. So you have to look at history. If you look at history from that local perspective, from the Gond perspective, it is a very, very different story altogether.
Thank you very much for answering that, Ms. Sengupta. My next question is again for Dr. Chakraborty. Amidst the surge of mindless commercializing and politicking by the media, how are tribal communities affected? Do you feel that their rich traditions, cultures, and heritage are under critical threat?
Yes, they are. They are under critical threat. But then again, there are also different kinds of attempts at preserving that culture, disseminating that culture. For example, there is this publication house called Adivani, which has come up with these stories, illustrated stories associated with Adivasi folk tales, myths, legends, etc. Uh, Harsda Shovendra Shekhar has written 4 books so far. He is also the winner of the Sahitya Academy Yuva Puruskar. So there are people who are trying to voice Adivasi experiences. There are people who are trying to rescue Adivasi identity, literature, and culture from the sweeping flood of dominant discourses of one kind or another. But that only sort of highlights the need for resistance, and that need for resistance of course comes from the kind of threat that exists uh, as far as these particular Adivasi communities, their literature, language, and associated cultural expressions are concerned. And there is also often an attempt at appropriating these Adivasi communities under a broad banner of Hinduism, as a result of which we often see that certain kinds of Adivasi rituals, customs, etc., are becoming Sanskritized. So that kind of an appropriation and subsequent erasure is also there. And even when we look at something as vibrant as Bengali culture, there again we see that whether it is the global dominance of English or the pseudo nationalistic thrust on Hindi, both are endangering regional cultures, be it Bengali, be it Udiya, be it Telugu, Tamil, whatever. And of course, when it comes to Adivasi cultures, the threat is magnified further. So obviously that problem is something which exists very much in today's world, and we need to be conscious about it and try and combat it as effectively as possible through uh, varied cultural representation.
Thank you very much for answering that. My next question is for Dr. Bera. The fact that all women troops are being set up now in Purulia points to a positive rupture in a once strictly guarded male domain. Do you feel or do you think these are signs of vanishing taboos and conscious female rebellion?
So the presence of women in Purulia Chou dance, or the all-women Chou troops, as you have mentioned, which are recently now being set up in Purulia, is of course a sign of vanishing taboo, I feel. But I am not sure whether I would call it rebellion, conscious rebellion against patriarchy, because the introduction of female show performers started in 1980s. It was Chandrasekhar Mahato, if I remember correctly, who actually introduced female performers in the show troops. And then we also have Shunita Mahato. She also started female show troops long back. But of course, nowadays, uh, all women show troops have become popular. So they were not popular back in 1980s or 1990s. So I would rather call it a kind of response and participation in the living cultural tradition of show dance.
Thank you very much for answering that, Dr. Bera. My last question for this evening is for Ms. Sengupta. It is unfortunate that Rani Durgavati, the icon of a valiant monarch and protector of her tribal subjects, has now been reduced and often misrepresented in political narratives. Would you say a syncretism between tribal and other cultures, as in the case of Durgavati's history, can bring out a greater inclusiveness and unity, or would it be a corruption of indigeneity?
Thank you for that question. Actually, Dr. Chakraborty mentioned something about appropriation of mainstream uh, s- images or mainstream trends into tribal life. I would like to say that when it comes to the Gonds of Garha Mandla, uh, this trend is not true, because this give and take between their customs and their religious beliefs and their cosmogony and that of Vedic Hinduism, Brahminical Hinduism, began long, long ago. In fact, if you look at the Gond myths and you look at their the deities that they worship, alongside deities like Narayan Dev is their main deity, but they also have specific deities for specific activities in the household. For instance, Dulha Deo is the god of cooking, and similarly there is a god of cattle and so on. But alongside these deities, they are also worshippers of Bhairo, which is Shiv, and they are worshippers of Durga, which is why, if you go to Jabalpur and surrounding areas and talk to the Gond people from the Gond Samaj, they call themselves a community, Gond Samaj, you will find that they wear yellow. In fact, I am also wearing yellow in Rani Durgavati's honor. They wear yellow. Gond men will wear yellow turbans or yellow dhotis. Women will wear yellow saris in memory of Rani Durgavati, and it is part of their cultural fabric as well. This kind of close proximity to Rajputs and a syncretic culture which includes an entire Hindu pantheon as well. In fact, if I just mentioned Yadorai and Ratnabali, in the origin myths of the Rajgond dynasty, they are shown that there are three people. There is a man, there are two men, and there is a woman, and followed by a monkey who go to the Narmada, and that's where the god comes to them and tells them, you have to go all the way to Garha Mandla, which is where you will start a great dynasty. Now, these three people who come to Garha Mandla are none other than Ram, Lakshman, and Sita, and the monkey is of course Hanuman. Now, the origin myths of the Rajgond dynasty itself has a very, very strong Hindu sort of religious angle to it, and if you look at the kind of temples that have been consecrated by the Rajgond rulers, Rani Durgavati's very powerful father-in-law Sangram Shah, who was a Gond king, he is responsible for consecrating the Bhairo temple in Jabalpur. She herself has consecrated several temples in Jabalpur, including the Sharda Mata Mandir near Madan Mahal in Jabalpur. Sangram Shah is also associated with the Chausat Jogini temple. Again, this is Shiv and Parvati. The Garbhagriha, Shiv and Parvati are the presiding deities. So what I'd like to say is that this appropriation may be when it comes to the Gonds, and like I said, I can only talk about the Gonds. I do not have adequate knowledge about any other tribal communities elsewhere in India, but I can say for the Gonds, this appropriation, or the thought that there has been appropriation, that this syncreticity is maybe an appropriation, is definitely a modern polemic. It is not something that was intrinsic to the Gond thought from the Middle Ages onwards.
Thank you very much for answering that, ma'am. With that, we come to an end to tonight's discussion. I thank each one of you for sharing your knowledge and valuable insights with us. I'm sure our audience had a wonderful time and have learned a lot as well. We are grateful to you all for taking out time from your extremely busy schedules and for being a part of this discussion. It was an absolute pleasure to have been in your company this evening. This is to remind that we are calling for submissions.
Thank you.
This is to remind that we are calling for submissions on tribal history and tribal representation in history, the details of which can be viewed on www.tellmeyourstory.biz. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.